The smell reached the corridor before the sound did. It was the sharp, bitter smell of burned metal and scorched plating, the kind of smell that made station workers stop walking and look around for the source. On Vailthar Prime, a diplomatic hub floating at the edge of the Cygnus spiral arm, strange smells were not unusual. The station hosted over 60 alien species at any given time, and each one brought its own scents, its own sounds, its own particular way of making humans feel like small, unremarkable creatures standing at the edge of something very large and very old. But this smell was different. This smell had fear in it. The hatchling had been found 3 days ago. A dock worker named Pete Larson had spotted it first, curled behind a broken cargo loader in Bay 17, barely the size of a large dog. Its dark blue scales cracked along the sides, and its golden eyes wide with a terror that Pete said later he would never quite forget. He had tried to get closer. The hatchling had responded by shooting a burst of pale flame at his left boot and screaming in a frequency that knocked 2 nearby alien traders off their feet. Since then, nobody had gotten close. The station's medical team had tried. They came in protective suits with long-handled tools, moving carefully, speaking softly. The hatchling burned the first tool, clawed the second, and screamed so loudly at the third attempt that a junior medic fainted. Station security had tried next. 4 officers, full shielding, coordinated movement. The hatchling backed into a corner, opened its small wings to their full, trembling span, and breathed fire continuously for 40 seconds until the officers retreated with singed equipment and bruised pride. Even the alien delegates had tried. A Valorian empathy specialist, a species known across the galaxy for their ability to calm distressed creatures, walked into the corridor alone, arms open, radiating warmth. The hatchling looked at her for a long moment. Then it bit clean through the railing beside her, and she left at a pace that was technically not running, but was very close to it. The Draconeth Elder Council had been contacted on the first day. Their response had come back in less than an hour, cold and formal. A hatchling that could not bond, could not be calmed, could not be approached, was considered spirit-broken under Draconeth law. The council would not send a retrieval unit. The council would not accept the creature back. If the hatchling could not find its footing in the world on its own, then the world was not the place for it. It was a brutal law. It was also, the council noted, a very old one. Station Commander Diana Rourke had read that message 3 times. Then she had put it face down on her desk and started making other calls. None of them had worked. Now it was day 3. The hatchling had not eaten. It had barely slept, based on the camera feeds. Just short, exhausted bursts of unconsciousness before jerking awake again at every sound and every shadow. It was getting weaker. The burns on its scales were not healing the way they should. The golden eyes, which Pete Larson had described as terrifying, now looked to Diana less like the eyes of a dangerous creature and more like the eyes of something that had been frightened for so long it had forgotten there was another way to feel. She was standing outside the sealed corridor looking at the camera feed on her handheld screen when she heard the tap of a wooden staff on the floor behind her. "I heard there's a dragon problem," said Eric Calloway. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself like someone who understood exactly where his body ended and the world began. He was broad across the shoulders, with short blonde hair going gray at the sides, and a short beard that had given up being neat some time ago. His eyes were pale and still, not moving the way sighted eyes moved, not tracking or searching. He held a carved wooden staff in his right hand, dark wood, worn smooth from years of use. He was dressed in the simple gray clothes of a station consultant, nothing remarkable, nothing that would make you look twice in a crowd, unless you knew who he was. Diana had read his file when he first came aboard as a security consultant 2 years ago. Eric Calloway, 41 years old, born in Minnesota, former competitor in historical Nordic martial arts, a discipline that involved weapons, grappling, and the kind of calm under pressure that most people spent entire careers trying to find. He had lost his sight in a pressure accident during a deep dock inspection 3 years ago. He had not gone home. He had stayed, learned the station through his other senses, and quietly become one of the most reliable problem solvers on Veilthar Prime. He did not advertise this. He just showed up when things were difficult, like now. The medical team couldn't get near it, Diana said. Security couldn't either. It has burned or broken everything we've sent in. I know, Eric said. I could hear it from 3 corridors away. He paused. Not the fire, the crying underneath the fire. Diana looked at him. Then she looked at the camera feed where the small hatchling was huddled in the far corner of the sealed corridor, wings pressed flat, sides heaving with each breath. I'll need someone to walk me to the corridor entrance, Eric said. After that, I go alone. It will burn you, Diana said. Eric considered this. Maybe, he said. Or maybe it's just never met anyone who wasn't afraid of it. Diana looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the hatchling on the screen. Then she called out to the nearest officer and said, "Walk him to the entrance." Eric adjusted his grip on his staff and followed the sound of the officer's footsteps. Behind him, Diana watched the screen. In the corner of the sealed corridor, the hatchling lifted its head, as if somehow it had already heard something different coming. The corridor was long and narrow, and it smelled like ash. The officer stopped at the entrance, punched in the code to unseal the door, and stepped back. He did not offer to go further. Eric did not ask him to. He simply listened for a moment, head slightly tilted, staff held loose in his right hand, and then he walked through the door alone. The door sealed behind him with a soft click. The hatchling heard it immediately. There was a sharp hiss from the far end of the corridor, and then the pale flicker of flame. Not a full burst, just a warning. A small tongue of fire that lit the corridor for half a second and then died. Eric stopped walking. He stood still and let the silence come back. He did not speak. He did not call out to the creature or try to make soothing sounds the way the medical team had. He simply stood there, breathing slowly, the way he had learned to breathe in competition. In through the nose, out through the mouth, long and even, until the body believed there was nothing to be afraid of. It was a trick his old coach had taught him years ago in a cold gymnasium back in Minnesota. Calm is not something you feel first, the old man used to say. Calm is something you do first, and the feeling follows. Eric did it now. He breathed, he waited, then he moved, not toward the hatchling but sideways. He found the wall with one hand, followed it a few steps, and sat down on the floor. Not a chair, not a crate. The floor itself, cross-legged, staff across his knees, back against the wall. The way a person sits when they are planning to stay for a while. From the far end of the corridor, the hatchling watched him. It had watched every other creature that came through that door. It had watched them come in fast or come in slow, come in groups or come in alone, come in with tools or come in with open hands. Every single one of them had carried the same thing with them. That sharp electric smell that the hatchling had learned in its very short life meant danger was coming. It was the smell of fear, though the hatchling had no word for it. It only knew that the smell always came before something bad happened, and so the smell itself had become the enemy. This creature on the floor did not have that smell. The hatchling pushed its nose forward slightly, testing the air. It was confused. The being was clearly alive. It was breathing. It had warmth. It moved when it sat down. But there was no sharpness to it. No electricity. The hatchling had never encountered this before, and it did not know what to do with the information. So it did what young creatures do when they encounter something they cannot explain. It watched, and it waited. Eric, for his part, was listening. He could hear the hatchling's breathing, ragged and fast at first, the breath of something that had been frightened for days without rest. He could hear the small scrape of claws on the floor as it shifted its weight. He could hear very faintly the low sound it made in the back of its throat. Not quite a growl and not quite a cry, something caught in between. It was the sound, Eric thought, of a creature that was exhausted all the way down to its bones, but did not know how to stop being afraid. He knew that sound. He had heard it in himself, in the long, dark months after the accident that took his sight. Lying in the medical bay, listening to the sounds of the station around him, unable to see a single thing, he had made that same sound, quiet and private, in the middle of the night when he thought no one could hear. So he did the only thing that had helped him back then. He started to hum. It was an old tune. His grandmother had sung it to him when he was very small, a Norwegian folk melody with no particular name that he had ever known. Just a slow, rolling pattern of notes that went up and came back down and went up again, like breathing itself set to music. She had hummed it when she worked in her kitchen, when she walked in the garden, when she sat beside him during thunderstorms and let him know without words that the noise outside was not something to fear. He hummed it now, quietly, not performing it but simply letting it exist in the corridor the way the ash smell existed, the way the dim light existed, just another thing in the air. The hatchling went very still. It had never heard music before. The Draconeth did not use music in the way humans did. Their communication was built on resonance and frequency, deep chest sounds and wing patterns. But something in the shape of Eric's humming reached past all of that. It was not threatening. It did not rise sharply or demand anything. It simply moved through the air in a pattern that felt, in some way the hatchling could not name, like it was meant for no one specific, and therefore could belong to anyone. The hatchling took one step forward. Then it stopped. Eric kept humming. He did not react to the step. He did not turn his head or shift his body. He just continued, note by note, the same slow melody, as if he had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. 3 minutes passed, then 5. The hatchling took another step, stopped again. Its golden eyes were fixed on the human sitting on the floor, and the confusion in them was slowly, carefully, mixing with something else, something quieter. Outside the corridor, Diana Rourke was standing with 6 other crew members around a monitor screen, all of them watching without a word. One of the younger officers had her hand over her mouth. Nobody spoke because nobody wanted to break whatever was happening inside that corridor by making a sound that might travel through the door. Eric stopped humming. He turned his head slightly, not toward the hatchling, but just enough to show he was aware. And he opened his right hand, palm up, flat on his knee, not reaching forward, not offering it across the space between them, just open, available, the way you might leave a door unlocked without swinging it wide. The hatchling stared at the open hand. It took a very long time. It stood at the far end of the corridor, and it looked at the open hand, and it breathed. And Eric sat against the wall and breathed too. And the old tune was gone now, but the shape of it still seemed to be in the air, the memory of something gentle. Then the hatchling walked forward. It moved slowly, one careful step at a time, its cracked blue scales catching the low corridor light. It stopped twice. It lowered its head and raised it again. It made the low sound in its throat once more, but softer this time, more question than warning. Eric did not move. He kept his palm open and his breathing even, and his face calm in the particular way that had nothing to do with trying to look calm and everything to do with actually being it. The hatchling reached him. It stretched its neck forward, slow as anything, and pressed the very tip of its snout against the center of Eric's open palm. It was the lightest touch. Barely there, barely real, but it was voluntary, chosen. The first time since Bay 17 that the creature had touched anything in the world without burning it first. Eric felt the warmth of it against his skin. He did not close his fingers. He did not move at all. He simply let the touch exist. On the monitor screen, one of the officers made a sound that was not quite a word. Diana Rourke said nothing. She just watched the screen with very still eyes and felt something shift in the room around her. The particular shift that happens when something that was broken begins, slowly and carefully, to consider the possibility of being whole. At the far end of an urgent communication channel, 3 Draconeth elders had been watching the same feed in silence for the past 10 minutes. Now one of them spoke, low and fast, and the other 2 turned to look at him. And the word he said, though it did not translate directly into any human language, meant something close to impossible, and then something close to and yet. The word came through at dawn. Station time on Veilthar Prime ran on a 26-hour cycle, and by the time the Draconith Council's official communication arrived, most of the night crew had already heard pieces of it through informal channels. The kind of quiet, fast-moving talk that spreads through a station the way smoke moves through corridors, finding every gap and crack until everyone knows something important has happened even before anyone has said it clearly. Diana Rourke read the message in her office with a cup of cold coffee in her hand and her eyes moving slowly across each line. She read it twice. Then she set the coffee down and went to find Eric. He was in the small side room off the medical bay where they had set up a temporary space for the hatchling the night before. It was nothing impressive, some heat padding on the floor, a water source, soft lighting, but Eric had insisted it be quiet. No hum of equipment if it could be helped. No sharp overhead lights. The hatchling, whom Eric had already started calling Ash in the easy, matter-of-fact way that meant he had decided on the name and was not planning to discuss it, was curled against his left side, her small sides rising and falling in the deep, slow rhythm of real sleep. Genuine sleep. Not the short, terrified bursts from the corridor days, but actual rest. The kind that only comes when something inside has decided it is safe. Eric was awake, his back against the wall, his staff across his knees. He was not doing anything in particular, he was just there, present, the way he had been in the corridor, being a steady thing in the room. Diana stood in the doorway for a moment before she spoke. "The Draconith Council sent a formal message," she said, keeping her voice low. "I figured they would," Eric said. "Do you know what a Vithara is?" Eric was quiet for a second. "No." Diana stepped inside the room and crouched down so she did not have to speak across a distance. She read from the message in plain, simple terms because the original Draconith language had been translated into something formal and layered that took some untangling. The Vithara, she explained, was what the Draconith called a soul bridge. It was a bond that a hatchling could form in the earliest days of its life. Not with just anyone, not through any ceremony or choice made by adults or elders or law. It was made by the hatchling alone, through instinct, through some deep internal recognition that the Draconith had never fully explained even to themselves because it operated beneath explanation. It happened when a hatchling, in a moment of genuine fear and genuine choice, reached out to another being and made first contact on its own terms. Ash had done that. In the corridor, when she pressed her nose to Eric's open palm, she had made a Vithara. "It means she is bonded to you," Diana said, "spiritually and legally under Draconith tradition. It cannot be undone. The Council's own records call it sacred above clan law." Eric did not say anything immediately. Ash shifted slightly in her sleep and made a small sound, low and warm, and pressed closer to his side. Eric put one hand on her back without thinking about it, the way you steady something you have already decided to take care of. "What does she need right now?" he asked. "Practically, today." Diana blinked. She had expected more questions about the bond, about the implications, about what it meant for his position on the station. "Warmth," she said after a moment. "Consistent presence. Protein-rich nutrition as soon as she is ready to eat. Draconith hatchlings in this stage need a bonded presence nearby when they sleep, or they will not reach full rest cycles." "All right," Eric said simply. "Then that's what we do." Diana looked at him sitting there in the dim room with a baby dragon asleep against his ribs, and the most ancient bond in Draconith culture apparently wrapped around the two of them like something quiet and inevitable. And she felt the particular feeling of watching something happen that was much larger than the room it was happening in. She almost left it there. But there was one more part of the message. "There is a problem," she said. Eric waited. "The council is divided. Some of the elders, particularly the older warrior class, are deeply opposed to this. A human bonded to a pure-blood hatchling has never happened. They feel it is a violation of Draconith bloodline tradition." She paused. "One elder in particular, a senior warrior named Vethkar, has announced that he is traveling here personally. He intends to challenge the validity of the bond. Under their law, he has the right to invoke something called Vethara dissolution, a formal challenge that tests whether the bonded individual is truly worthy. And if he decides I'm not? The bond is broken by ceremony. Ash would be returned to Draconith custody. Diana kept her voice steady. And the dissolution process itself, it is not simple. It involves trials, physical and personal. Eric nodded slowly. He did not look worried. He did not look fearless either. It was something in between, something more honest than either of those things. He looked like a man who had already accepted that difficult things were coming and had decided to deal with them in order, one at a time. "How long until he arrives?" Eric asked. 4 days. "Then we have 4 days to make sure Ash is eating and sleeping properly," Eric said. "Everything else comes after." Diana stood up. She looked at Ash one more time, the small, cracked blue scales slowly beginning to look less raw than they had in the corridor, the golden eyes closed in real sleep. One small claw curled loosely against Eric's boot like a child holding on to something familiar. She thought about the Draconeth Elder's word again, the one that meant impossible, and then meant and yet. She thought it suited the situation fairly well. Meanwhile, on a Draconeth warship 3 days out from Vaelthar Prime, Elder Vethkar sat in his chambers and studied the footage from the station corridor. He had watched it 4 times now. The blind human, the open hand, the hatchling choosing of its own will to cross the distance. He did not know yet what he would find when he arrived. He did not know if the human was strong enough, worthy enough, real enough for a bond of this weight. Vethkar had spent 140 years in service to Draconith tradition, and he had seen the Vethara invoked twice in that time, both times between Draconith and Draconith, both times witnessed and celebrated. He had never seen it reach across species. He had never imagined it could. He watched the footage a 5th time. The human sitting on the floor, the hatchling walking forward in the dark, slow and careful and afraid, and then not afraid. The touch, the stillness after. Vethkar turned the footage off. He stared at the blank screen for a long time, and somewhere beneath the discipline of a warrior elder who had made this journey to challenge and to test, something very old and very honest sat quietly and admitted that it did not yet know what it was going to find. The ship moved through the dark between stars, 4 days out and closing. Vethkar arrived on the 3rd day instead of the 4th. His ship docked at Bay 3 with no ceremony and no announcement beyond the standard clearance signal, but the station felt his arrival anyway. It moved through the corridors the same way all significant things moved through Vaelthar Prime. Quietly, quickly, in the space between one person telling another and the next person already knowing. By the time the elder Draconith warrior stepped off the docking ramp, there were no crowds, but every crew member within 3 corridors had found a reason to be somewhere nearby. He was enormous. That was the first thing. Vethkar stood nearly 3 meters tall in his compressed bipedal form, the shape the Draconeth took when moving through stations built for smaller species. His scales were the deep charcoal gray of very old stone, and they carried the particular texture of a body that had survived things. Long scars ran across his neck and left shoulder, pale against the dark gray, each one with its own history. His eyes were amber, sharp and still, and they moved across everything they encountered with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent a very long time deciding what was dangerous and what was not. He had brought no escort. That, Diana Rourke noted when she met him at the bay, was either a good sign or a very confident one. The ceremonial space had been prepared in Vaelthar Prime's main gathering hall, the largest open room on the station, used for diplomatic assemblies and formal proceedings. The Draconeth, cultural requirements for a Vethara trial, had been sent ahead in the council's communications, and the station crew had followed them carefully. The floor was cleared. The lighting was low and warm. There were no chairs, no tables, just open space and the weight of old tradition sitting in the air like something physical. Eric was already there when Vethkar entered. He stood in the center of the room with Ash at his side. The hatchling had grown visibly in 4 days. Not dramatically, but enough to notice. Her cracked scales had begun to smooth at the edges. She was eating now, properly, twice a day, and the wild terror that had lived in her golden eyes since Bay 17 had not disappeared entirely, but had retreated to something smaller and more manageable. She still startled at sudden sounds. She still pressed close to Eric when strangers came near. But she was upright and present, and her eyes were clear. She saw Vethkar come through the door and her whole body went rigid. She knew, in the way hatchlings know things that no one has told them, what he was, what he represented. She pressed against Eric's left leg and made the low sound in her throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a cry. Eric put his hand on her head. "I've got you," he said quietly. Just that. Ash did not fully relax, but she stayed. Vethkar stopped 10 feet away and looked at the two of them for a long moment. His amber eyes moved from Eric's still face to the hatchling pressed against his leg to the carved wooden staff in Eric's right hand. He said nothing yet. He was assessing. It was what he did. Then he spoke, and the translation unit on Diana's handheld rendered his words into flat, serviceable English. "I am here to determine if this bond is real or if it is simply an accident that the law must correct." "That seems fair," Eric said. Vethkar studied him. "You are not afraid." "I didn't say that," Eric replied. Another pause. Then Vethkar announced the 3 tests in the formal Draconith manner. Each one named, each one explained. No room for confusion about what was being asked. The first test, the second test, the third test. He delivered them without drama, the way someone reads from something very old that does not need decoration because its age is enough. The first test was presence. Vethkar walked to the far end of the room. He turned. He drew himself to his full height, expanded his chest, opened his jaw, and released a Draconith war cry, the sound that elder warriors used in battle, the frequency that was designed specifically to break the nerve of whatever stood in front of it. It hit the walls of the hall and came back doubled. Several of the station crew watching from the doorway physically stepped back. One officer knocked into the wall behind her. Eric stood still. Not stiff, still. The specific stillness of someone whose nervous system had been trained over many years to receive impact and not collapse under it. His feet were planted. His breathing continued. His face did not change. Ash whimpered once beside him, and he pressed his hand gently to her back, and she steadied too, taking her cue from him the way she had been doing for 4 days now. Vethkar lowered his head. He said nothing, but something in his posture shifted. Barely, just slightly. He moved to the second test. The second test was sacrifice. A station officer led Ash through a side door into a chamber on the far end of the hall. The door sealed. Then Vethkar gestured toward the corridor that connected the main hall to that chamber, and the heat came on. Not fire, but wave after wave of dry, disorienting heat that made the air shimmer and the ears fill with a low, resonant tone that pushed against concentration and balance. It was not designed to injure. It was designed to make you want to stop and turn around. Eric walked into it. He moved the way he always moved, staff forward, reading the floor, head slightly tilted to track sound. Ash was crying from inside the chamber. Not in panic, but in the particular way she cried when she wanted Eric specifically, a sound he had already learned to recognize the way you learn the sounds of someone you live with. He followed it through the heat and the noise, step by step, not hurrying, not stopping. He reached the chamber door in just under 2 minutes. It opened when he touched it. Ash came out and pushed her head against his chest, and he held her there for a moment, one hand on her neck before he turned back toward the hall. Vethkar watched him return. The amber eyes were different now. Still sharp, still careful, but the calculation in them had changed quality. It was no longer the assessment of someone looking for weakness. It was something closer to attention. genuine attention. The third test was truth. Vethkar crossed the room and stood directly in front of Eric, close enough that the size difference was impossible to ignore, close enough that the heat of a Draconith elder's body was a physical presence in the air. He looked down at the human with the still pale eyes and the worn wooden staff and the hatchling now wrapped around his shoulders like she intended to stay there permanently. "Do you believe yourself worthy of this bond?" Vethkar asked. The hall was completely silent. Eric was quiet for long enough that it did not seem like hesitation. It seemed like honesty, the kind that needs a moment to find its exact shape before it can be spoken. "No," he said, "I don't. I'm a blind man on a space station who sat on a corridor floor and hummed an old song. I did not do anything remarkable. I just didn't leave." He paused. "But Ash seems to think differently about it. And I have spent 4 days watching how she reads the world around her, and her judgment is better than mine, so I trust it more than my own." The silence held. Then Vethkar did something that no one in the room had expected, including Diana Rourke, who had been watching elder Draconith warriors in diplomatic settings for 11 years, and thought she had a reasonable understanding of their range of behavior. He bowed. It was not a small gesture. It was a full, deliberate bow, head down, wings partially extended in the Draconith gesture of formal recognition. It lasted 3 seconds. Then he straightened, and when he looked at Eric again, the amber eyes were clear and direct, and carrying something that had not been there when he walked through the door. "The bond is valid," Vethkar said, and then, quieter, in a tone that the translation unit rendered almost gently, "The hatchling chose well." Ash lifted her head from Eric's shoulder and looked at the elder warrior with her golden eyes. She made the low, warm sound, the one the crew had started calling trust, and then tucked her head back down against Eric's neck as if the whole matter was settled, and she had known it would be from the beginning. Perhaps she had. The news left Vaelthar Prime the same way all important things leave a place, quietly at first and then all at once. It went through the station's internal channels before the trial had even officially closed. It moved from crew member to crew member the way a good story always moves, picking up small details as it traveled, each person adding the part that had struck them most. The blind man who sat on the floor, the old song, the open hand, the hatchling choosing to cross the distance on her own. By the time the formal record was filed by Diana Rourke and transmitted through diplomatic channels, the story was already 3 steps ahead of the paperwork, doing what true stories do, finding its own way into the places that matter. Within 2 days, it had reached 6 other stations along the Cygnus spiral arm. Within a week, it had reached the outer diplomatic relays. Vethkar did not leave Vaelthar Prime immediately after the trial. This surprised people. A warrior elder of his rank had no administrative reason to stay. The trial was complete, the bond was validated, his duty was done. But he remained for 5 more days, and during that time he did something that the station crew found quietly remarkable. He spent time with Ash. Not formal time, not ceremonial observation. He would simply appear in the corridor near Eric and Ash's shared quarters in the early station hours, when the halls were mostly empty, and sit, in the way that very large, ancient creatures can sit when they choose to, taking up space without apology. Ash, who had gone rigid at the sight of him in the trial hall, approached him on the 3rd day with careful, curious steps. Vethkar stayed perfectly still. He let her set the pace. And by the 4th day, Ash was sleeping occasionally in the warm space near his feet, and Vethkar would sit with his hands on his knees and watch her breathe and say nothing at all. Eric, who always knew more about what was happening around him than people expected, said nothing about these visits either. He simply made sure Ash knew where he was at all times, and he trusted her to move toward what she needed. On the 5th day, before his ship departed, Vethkar came to find Eric directly. They stood in the small room that had become Ash's home space, the heat padding, the soft lighting, Ash draped across a low platform nearby in the deep sleep that had become her normal now. Vethkar looked at the room for a moment, at the worn staff leaning against the wall, at the simple order of the space, at Ash sleeping with the particular ease of something that has stopped waiting for the next terrible thing to happen. "I came here to dissolve this bond," Vethkar said. He did not say it with shame, just with plainness, the way honest things are best said. "I know," Eric said. "I have served Draconith tradition for 140 years. I have never questioned the principle that our hatchlings belong within our bloodline, within our kind." He paused. "I still believe that tradition carries weight, but I also believe that tradition exists to protect what is real. And what is real here..." He stopped, looked at Ash, looked back at Eric. "What is real here does not need my protection. It is already whole." Eric was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She did the hard part, I just stayed." Vethkar made a sound low in his chest. Not quite a laugh, not quite agreement, something in between that translated into no single human word, but meant something close to yes. And that is exactly the point. He left that morning, but before his ship cleared the docking bay, a formal transmission arrived from the Draconith Elder Council. Not the divided, uncertain communication of the days before the trial, but a unanimous declaration, signed by every sitting elder, including Vethkar himself. It announced two things. The first was that Ash of the Vethara Bond was to be given a new formal clan designation, the first Draconith in recorded history to carry a human name alongside her Draconith lineage. She was to be known in council records as Ash of the Callaway Vethara, a designation that placed her bond with Eric not as an exception to tradition, but as a part of it. Permanent, documented, real. The second was a formal request, addressed to the Human Diplomatic Office aboard Vaelthar Prime, asking that a human cultural liaison be assigned to the Draconith homeworld. The first such request the Draconith had ever made in 400 years of contact with other species. The Council's stated reason was brief and direct. They wished to understand better the particular quality that the human Eric Callaway had demonstrated in the corridor. They did not have a word for it in their own language. They wanted to learn more. Diana Rourke read the transmission in her office and sat with it for a long time before she responded. Life on the station settled into a new shape around Eric and Ash, the way life always settles around things that have found their proper place. Ash grew steadily. Her scales, once cracked and raw, came in smooth and deep blue with a faint luminescence along the ridge of her spine that the medical team said was a sign of a healthy bond in young Draconith. The body expressing, in its own language, that something internal was right. She learned to respond to Eric's voice cues, to the tap of his staff, to the particular rhythm of his presence moving through a room. She learned the station's corridors faster than most new crew members did, and she developed opinions about which ones she preferred, usually the warmer ones near the engineering deck. Eric, in turn, learned things from Ash that he had not expected to learn. She tracked heat sources with extraordinary sensitivity, and living closely with her sharpened his own awareness of warmth and air movement in a room. She communicated through posture and pressure and the weight of her body against his, a whole vocabulary of closeness that required no sight and no sound. They built a language between them that belonged entirely to the two of them, constructed from the particular materials of who they each were. His stillness and her instinct, his patience and her curiosity, his long knowledge of how to move through a world without seeing it, and her natural genius for reading everything a body could say. People on the station noticed, not loudly, but genuinely. There was a quality to the space around Eric and Ash that was difficult to name but easy to feel. A kind of settled calm, the specific atmosphere of two beings who had found the exact right place to be and were simply living in it, one ordinary day after another. It was a young Valorian child visiting the station with her family who asked the question that everyone had been thinking for months. She was perhaps 7 years old by Valorian reckoning, small and wide-eyed, and she had been staring at Eric and Ash from across the common area for a long, careful time before she gathered herself and walked over. Ash watched her approach with calm, golden eyes and made no move toward alarm, which was its own kind of answer to a question nobody had asked yet. The child stopped in front of Eric and looked up at him with the direct, unself-conscious honesty that very young creatures share across most species. "How did you know she would not hurt you?" she asked. Eric was quiet for a moment. He turned his face slightly toward the child in the way he had of orienting toward a voice, and he thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I didn't know," he said, "but she was crying, and someone had to go and sit with her." The child considered this. Then she looked at Ash, who was draped across Eric's shoulders in the way she had taken to traveling recently, long body curved around the back of his neck, tail hanging loosely down one side, golden eyes half open, and watching the room with the comfortable authority of someone who has decided this is their place, and that is the end of the matter. "Do you remember?" the child asked Ash directly. "Do you remember being scared?" Ash looked at the child for a long moment with those deep, golden eyes. Then she made a sound, low and warm and unhurried, starting somewhere in her chest and moving outward like something that had been kept carefully and was now being offered. It was not fire. It was not a cry. It was the sound the crew had been calling trust since the night in the corridor, the sound that the station logs had recorded as unclassified because no existing category had been designed to hold it. The child smiled the wide, simple smile of someone who has understood something important without needing it explained. The common area continued around them, crew members walking past, alien delegates in quiet conversation, the ordinary sounds of a station doing its daily work. Eric stood with Ash on his shoulders and his staff in his hand, and somewhere in the diplomatic channels the story was still moving, still traveling outward into the spaces between stations and species and old assumptions about what strength looks like and who is allowed to carry it. And in the station logs, under the entry for that evening, a junior crew member whose job was routine documentation wrote a single line that no one asked for and no one deleted. It said, "The hatchling is well. The bond is whole." And it turned out that the bravest thing anyone did was simply stay.